All right, family. I appreciate your patience as I try to get some of this together. Turn that down. That's kind of loud, and it gives you an echo if you hear me watching myself to make sure the sound and everything is legit. I'm trying to work on what is this? Instagram is crazy. So either Facebook won't pick up or Instagram won't pick up. So we not gonna sweat it. We gonna keep the party going. You did. All right, that is my last attempt. So we gonna make this happen. We gonna do what we do, family. Let's turn this front camera on. All right. So, welcome to another episode of Swami Live. I'm so excited and so happy to be here with you. I look forward to our conversations and general discussions that we'll have. Well, our conversation around ego has been a very exciting one. Well, not exciting, but informative, and has offered me definitely several moments of clarity. If you are new here, this is Soul Swami Live, where we discuss healing in its various formats and all the different ways, all in an effort to try to become the best version of ourselves. We do this to create us a space where we can connect with other individuals and people who are also trying to evolve into the best version of themselves. So we have a collective energy, because one thing that's very important to understand about healing is it is a communal event. That means it takes a community to help your healing process, right? So we do this every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. And we also have a spinoff show that is on Thursday nights, which is Book Club, in an effort to allow us to reconnect with that childlike energy in us by having someone read to us. We started Book Club. It is also at 7 o'clock. So you can catch Soul Swami Live at 7 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday and Thursdays on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and Instagram when it's acting right, which is not today. Lo siento. I'm sorry for my people who want to watch Instagram. So make sure you hit that follow, that subscribe, any one of those things that allow you to get the notifications on when we go live. All right, Toddy, welcome. Glad to have you here. You must be planning on being, what is it? Active today, right? You're going to go beyond, hey, family. And I'm about to say, you know what? I don't even see that on the screen. Never mind. But anyway, glad to have you here. So generally, every week, we do a little bit of energy work by focusing on a different energy point. Some people like to call them chakras, but one of the things we try to do here is remove the mysticism from some of the things we're doing. So this week, we are on our third eye, or many of us recognize it as our intuition. Third eye resides right here in your forehead. It is for your intuition, your vision, your perception, and astral projection. I've talked to a couple of people, astral travel, and the quickest way to astral travel is through memories. You can have one of those thoughts where it could take you right back to that moment in time, as though you're still living it through the smells, the sounds, the people, all those things. So your third eye is good for that, right? If you are into color therapy, the color for your third eye is indigo, right? And so that means eat some more indigo food, wear some indigo colors, or spend some time in the indigo lights. All of those things will help activate the energy of your third eye, or the energy point of your intuition. If you are into essential oils, you want to think rosemary, cedarwood, clary sage, patchouli. All of those are very good scents for your third eye. If you are into crystals and gemstones, you want to think labradorite, amethyst, which is one of my favorites. This is my red amethyst, so I always reach to grab amethyst. It's hard to tell with this color light, but it is a reddish color. Purple fluorite and sodalite are all very good stones and gemstones for your third eye. Terrence, brother, glad to have you here as always. I hope I can give you some food today as we discuss a little bit about ego, where we continue our discussion on ego. I know it's definitely been some food for me, and we had that good conversation on Monday about how do we recognize which one is talking. So that's dope. So as a matter of fact, I might have to. Yeah, I did write that down as a general discussion. So I'm gonna pose that to the Soul family, see what they think. Right. So the next thing we do as our opening is we do a little sound therapy. So I'm going to tap this bowl. After we get finished with sound therapy, we do. Excuse me. After we do a little sound therapy, we do some breath work. Yeah, it's time. And then we do some affirmations, and then we get started on the show. So I just had a little moment with myself when I said breath work. I was trying to think of what breath exercise that we'll do, and 478 came to my mind. So that's why I was like, yeah, it's time. It's been coming up, but I just hadn't been doing it because it just didn't feel like the right time. But today feels like a good day to do some 478 breathing exercises. So during this time, all you really have to do is just relax, focus on releasing the energy of the day, getting into the space where we're growing, learning, healing, evolving, and just listen. Man, listen, the energy to communicate must be on fire because the bowl was extra loud, right? That's how I always adjusted what kind of energy we got going on how the things that we use respond when we use them. Tyler, we might have to reach out to Liberty, make sure she's all right. She ain't been on a couple of shows, so we're going to have to check on her, make sure she good. You know what I mean? She our family, and we worry about her all the time. You know what I mean? So that's one of the benefits of creating a space like this, because you got other people that show up for you, and you want to make sure that you are showing up for them and being available for them when you can. So we might have to reach out to one of the Soul family, see what's going on. I did just text her, so and as a matter of fact, this time I'm gonna tell her you co-signed. So I had to tell you what she says. All right, so the next thing that we'll do is some breath work. If you are unfamiliar with 478, that is, we will breathe in for a 4 count, we will hold for a 7 count, and we will exhale for an 8 count. This breath work is a good way to help you manage and navigate emotions and feelings and the things that just happen to us throughout the day. It's a good way to reset and specifically activate the energy of your third eye, your intuition. Helps balance you out and get a little bit of trust. Again, we're going to be 478. You just have to listen to me as I guide you through. Again, it is breathe in for a 4 count, hold for a 7 count, and exhale or release for a 8 count. Family, we will start 478 on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Breathe in 4, 2, 3, 4. Hold 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Release 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Breathe in 4, 2, 3, 4. Hold 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Release 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Last time, family. Breathe in 4, 2, 3, 4. Hold 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Release 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And as we sit in this space of relaxation and communal healing, I want you to take some time and repeat these affirmations after me again. These are things that you can say to help activate the energy of your third eye, your intuition, or to help balance out the energy you are navigating in the moment. So just repeat after me. I trust my intuition. My imagination is powerful. I think clearly. My third eye sees all. I trust my intuition. My imagination is powerful. I think clearly. My third eye sees all. All right, with that, family, we can start the show. Okay. So, let me take a little drink. I'm a little thirsty, parched. I feel like I should do some ASMR. All right, don't forget. I see you watching. If you have some time and you would like an energy reading, make sure you click on the link in the description and you can join the live and do an energy reading. Give a shout out, say something in the chat so I can show you a little bit of love. If not, just make sure you do what's comfortable for you. So no judgment, but introduce yourself. All right, so this is your weekly reminder that you can purchase the 7 Spaces of Healing for yourself. It is a good book to be able to help you conceptualize 7 spaces that you want to cultivate within yourself and ensure that you are part of to help your evolution to the best version of yourself, right? So it starts, you want to have a space of love, a space of healing, a space of solitude, a space of trust, a space of risk without judgment, a space of accountability, and a space for forgiveness. You can get your own copy right now. It's available for you on Amazon in ebook and softback, which we like to say. Softback. Don't forget, get it for yourself. As a matter of fact, I'm glad I said that because I need to send the link to my homeboy. So This week, general discussion, I want to ask the family a question that one of the brothers asked myself and the other brothers, right? And it was a very difficult question, right? So when we are talking about our healed self, right? There are several things that we listen to or we allow to guide us, right? So the question was, how do you know or how do you distinguish between your ego talking to you, your higher or healed self talking to you, or the universe, your ancestors, your God, whoever you connect to with that spirituality is speaking to you? How do you distinguish between those three? So, question for the soul family, put it in chat if you're feeling good. How do you distinguish between your ego, your higher self, and your ancestors speaking to you? So, when that was posed to me, I had to first acknowledge that that was a very difficult question because I never really thought about that, right? I never really thought about that. And then when I thought about it, my initial thought was, it's a feeling, right? But what does that mean? So I had to recognize that each one of these things create emotions, and from those emotions we wind up shaping our feelings. The stories that we tell ourselves is what feelings are based on the emotions that we feel, right? So the first thing, and I have to give the acknowledge why I started thinking this. So because we are talking about ego, I am learning some of this stuff, right, as well as sharing with you. So we are learning together. I'm not coming to you as an expert. So as we are discussing and talking about ego, I'm learning a little bit more about how ego functions in your life, right? And then because I have a better understanding of how ego functions in your life, I'm more inclined or I'm more capable of being able to recognize how my ego is functioning within myself, and also learning to recognize how ego is at play in other people in my interactions, right? So when it comes to that question, how do I recognize which one is speaking to me? The first thing I would have to say for myself is study, right? We have to study and have an understanding of how these things move, what they are, and how they function, right? So for our higher self, we have to study ourselves. And as we study ourselves, we have to create a roadmap or designs for how our higher self will function, right? And that is from studying. So now when I've created a roadmap, when my higher self is speaking to me, then I can recognize it because I created the paradigm. I designed how my higher self will function and what that looks like or what that safe space looks like, right? So now when my higher self is speaking to me, I understand that voice. Then when it comes to my ego, reason why I told you all this learning is good for me, because now I have a clearer understanding of how ego. Generally, when we talk about ego, the example we used in the men group is kind of like it's a pistol, right? And we just talk about it as a pistol, as that one unique thing, right? But really, when we learn more about ego, ego is an amalgamation of different pieces that come together to create that pistol, right? When we think about a pistol, there's a trigger, there's pins, there's springs, there's a magazine. There's a ton of different things that come together to form that pistol. So when we're talking about pistol, we're also including the elements. Now that I understand the ego, or I'm learning more about the ego, or the elements that the ego comes together to create that ego, I'm more inclined to be able to recognize when my ego is at play in talking to me. Like I said, and it also benefits when I'm interacting with other people, because then I also can recognize when the ego is at play with them, right? And when it comes to my ancestors, or when I'm speaking to my God, or whoever your spiritual connection is, that winds up being the voice that offers a sense of clarity. Like I always say on here, that alcoholic moment of clarity, right? That voice or that energy that provides that sense of clarity. That's how I know, that feeling that it creates. That's how I know which is working, right? So for yourself, how do you know? Have you taken time to study these different things so you do know what their voice sounds like, right? And as we talk a little bit about ego, um, I honestly am in a great a space of gratitude as it relates to ego, because as I'm learning more, like I said, I'm learning how to recognize when my ego is moving and where how it's working in my life. But something that I'm really excited about is how, now that I have a clearer understanding, I can recognize how ego is moving in somebody that I'm talking to, right? And the good thing about that is it's almost like it gives me this joy. Literally, it gives me a sense of happiness and a sense of joy, because then I take my power back, right? Now that I'm learning about ego, I can recognize all the times where someone else may have been functioning in their wounded ego, their weakened ego, their inflated ego, and depending on how they exhibited or they responded to me, I would respond back in the same way. I would give my power away to allow them to be able to manipulate my ego. But now that I'm in a space where I can see how other people's, how the ego moves, when that happens, I can still show up as my healthy ego. And instead of one of these other egos, because again, one of the main things we want to understand about the ego is there to protect you. That's his main function, right? And it protects you from good and it protects you from bad. Its job the ego does not define what is good or what is bad. It just defines what is in need of protecting from. So I really enjoy this conversation as it relates to the ego, because like I said, it's giving me an opportunity to take some of my power back, and hopefully it's giving you that same feeling of being able to take your power back, because now that you recognize ego, you can also recognize how it's at place in other people's lives. And then because you recognize it, even when they don't recognize it, because most people will not identify that their ego's at place. Like for me, I never thought that I was functioning in a space of inflated ego. But as we learn what inflated ego is and how inflated ego functions, I had to have that conversation with myself, that vulnerable conversation, that self-awareness, and admit that I too have been functioning at plenty of times in an inflated ego. All right. So for our review, last week we talked about what the ego is, period, right? So the ego is the rational organizing part of the mind. It operates on the reality principle, right? I put that quote up there because we also know perception is reality. Perception doesn't necessarily have to be true, but perception is reality, and the ego functions on this reality principle. What it is responding to does not necessarily have to be true. It just has to be perceived as true, right? So to help explain what that means, it helps you to plan, decide, remember, evaluate, and function in the world, right? Then we moved on to types of egos. Also, our discussion on ego is based on, it is two ways we're looking at it. We're looking at it as the functional ego and the identity ego. And all of this discussion that we're having in the review right now is the functional ego, right? And later on, we'll move into the identity ego, which specifically is the spirituality of the ego, right? So we went into healthy types of ego. We went into types of ego. The first one we discussed was the healthy ego and how that moves, right? The healthy ego, simply put, can tolerate reality, regulate emotions, and remain intact in the presence of stress, failure, and difference without the need to disassociate, distort, dominate, or disappear, right? So what that means is a healthy ego allows you to feel emotions without having to reshape the reality in a way where you don't feel as though you're being personally attacked, or you don't feel as though you're in a space where you have to defend yourself. So healthy ego can do a lot of that stuff, right? The next one we discussed was inflated ego. And that was an interesting one, right? Because we always have this understanding of what the inflated ego is. And essentially, it is partly correct in that the inflated ego is an overestimation of its importance, power, or competence, often as a defensive response to underlying insecurity, shame, or vulnerability. So our inflated ego can show up in these points where we feel vulnerable, which we all have experiences with vulnerability, but we just didn't recognize that in those moments, our inflated ego can show up, right? It can show up in those moments where we feel shame for some of the things that we endured. I was talking to a friend today, and I talked about something that I felt ashamed with, which is evidence or I can use as evidence that I'm functioning in a healthy ego because my inflated ego didn't show up to protect me from admitting that shame, right? It also shows up when we have some insecurity, right? So think about where we're at right now in this place and time. At least even with politics or how we function, there's a lot going on in this world that creates a certain level of insecurity, even something as wild as the hantavirus, right? That's creating a sense of insecurity in a lot of people. And when that insecurity shows up, it opens the door for our inflated ego to show up, right? Where we can over exaggerate ourselves, right? That is a little bit about the inflated ego. Now, today, we will start with the wounded or fragile ego, right? Which is definitely different than, we do the weak ego next. So it is definitely different than the inflated ego. And ironically, the inflated ego also shows up because of the wounded ego. So what is, a wounded ego? Wounded ego is injury to a person's sense of self-worth, a person's dignity, or identity that overwhelms normal coping mechanisms, right? So a wounded ego is one of those egos that show up when we have an unclear sense of self-worth, where we have an unclear design of our dignity, where our integrity is a little bit floundering, and our identity winds up being overwhelmed by our coping mechanisms. That's that times when we go for a walk and it doesn't work. That's that time when we do our workouts and it doesn't work. It's that time where we use our normal coping mechanisms and they don't work. Like some people turn to alcohol or drugs and they're just not necessarily working for you, right? And as I just stated, the inflated ego is usually in response to a wounded ego. Once that wound happens, the inflated ego shows up to help you still create a stable sense of self, whatever that means. What generally causes a wounded ego, right? So, first thing, and again, it does not have to be true. It just has to be perceived as the truth, right? It doesn't have to be fact. So, criticism or failure. Criticism and failure can help wound the ego. That's one of the reasons why we talk about be careful how you speak to your children when you're raising them, because their ego is being shaped at that moment, and you're giving them too much criticism. You're actually setting the foundation for a wounded ego. Rejection, perceived rejection, or abandonment can create a wounded ego, right? So those people who wind up experiencing abandonment from one parent, experiencing abandonment of where they felt as though friends left them and they're not showing up for them, those feelings of abandonment, whether they're true or not, the person could have just went to work. The wound on the ego is still there, right? Humiliation or shame. Many of us are shameful for some of the ways that we have responded to challenges in our lives, or even things that aren't necessarily challenges, but instead of admitting that shame, because we'll internalize those feelings of shame as being a identity trait instead of something that we're just experiencing at that moment, we can wind up wounding the ego by internalizing those feelings of shame or humiliation. Loss of status can create a wounded ego. I can tell you personally, one way that I wound up dealing with that loss of status is as I made a career change. I've done so much necessarily work in one career lane that I had a certain status. But now I'm switching. I don't really know what I want to switch to. I don't really know what that means for myself. And I'm quietly creating a wound on my ego. Good thing is I took some time to be able to heal that wound, so I would not allow the wounded ego to guide or lead my decisions in life, right? Loss of love. Many times we do not admit that breakups really do affect us. They do something to our ego. That loss of love, whether it's through a breakup, whether it's through the passing of a loved one, that loss of love, of someone that's important to you, someone that you care about, someone that you value, can wound your ego, and your wounded ego can show up. And if your wounded ego shows up, you can pretty much guarantee that your inflated ego is going to show up. Or that loss of identity is something that can wound your ego. I know this from working with people with doing Reiki, right? One of the main things that I've dealt with people's conflict or the evolution of themselves is around this identity. That's why we had a series on identity. And one of the biggest fears that people have when it comes to healing or evolving into the best version of themselves is that loss of identity, right? Many people were in this space where they feel as though their past experiences have shaped who they are, and they are the main ingredient that define who they are. So now we're in this space of healing, and we're asked to put that identity down and pick up a new identity. And that creates anxiety in people. That's a sign of the ego. Anxiety in people, because people really do have a question like, if I put this down, what I've taken years from experiences and to cultivate, who am I then? Which is a genuine fear, right? And that fear over that loss of identity winds up being reflective of a wounded or fragile ego, right? Another major one is the feeling of feeling unseen, invalidated, or powerless, right? I think when I do my Reiki sessions, one of the good things that come out of the Reiki session, and something that I recognize that people need, is right. One, many of us are touch deprived. So being touched in a loving way that does not require you to give something in exchange winds up being good. And everybody wants to be seen. They want to be seen for who they are. They want to be valued for who they are. And this doesn't even take into consideration if we have protected ourselves from being seen. And many of us, which is one of the things that I worked on, is we protect ourselves from being seen, but then also want to be seen. That conflicting nature winds up hurting us a little bit, and it also is evidence of us functioning in a wounded ego. So, wounded ego generally presents itself in two different ways. The first way is the externalizing wounded ego. So, what does that mean? The externalizing wounded ego is the ego that protects itself by pushing the pain outward, right? Those are those people that we see that just taking it out on the world. They're frustrated. They're kind of angry with their space in life. And when you interact with them, there's always this underlying energy of anger. Whether they're ready to admit it or not, it is there. That is an externalizing wounded ego. The perfect example that I can use is that time where I told you where I was a kid. We've mentioned one time when I was a kid, I was placed on punishment for a year and a half. And I remember sitting in the floor saying that when I get big, nobody's ever going to be able to tell me. So the wounds of my childhood ego wind up externalizing it as nobody's ever going to be able to tell me anything, right? Now, that's not really how I handle it, but for a lot of things in my life, that is exactly how I handle it. But that is an example of an externalizing ego. Drawing this line where you say, I'm not going to date no more because of this, or I'm not going to allow people to tell me this, or any of these things. Be careful, because it's not, a lot of times we guise that externalizing wounded ego as standards and boundaries. But we have something about that later on where we talked about, which is the rationalizing ego, right? We'll talk a little bit about the rationalizing ego later, but that example of externalizing it and masking it as boundaries is an example of the what's the word I'm looking for? Of the rationalizing ego. Common signs of an externalizing wounded ego is defensiveness or hostility, right? And I think that that's a good one. I actually kind of dealt with that somewhat today, right? You can know, it's like, have you ever had a conversation, somebody reach out to you, and you can already feel the underlying defensiveness, or you say something to them and they respond with low-level hostility, just enough so they can deny that they're being hostile. Or in the example that I use, that defensiveness, where I said no one was going to ever be able to tell me what to do, that defensiveness was a sign of my wounded ego, right? Another sign is the anger or the rage is disproportionate to what happened, right? So as wild as it is, I think about this a lot, right? My mother one time told me this story about my father. My father was a neat freak. I mean, beyond neat freak, super neat freak, right? But he was such a neat freak that when normal things happen, he didn't know how to respond to it. So like if you have a child in your house, you know one thing they're going to do. They're going to spill stuff, right? That is natural. I remember when I was in the classroom, we'd give a kid a cup and the kid would drop something and bend straight over with the cup, not realizing that they need to hold the cup. So they'll spill all this stuff. And I remember all the times I can tell what type of household this child is being raised in by how they responded to a spill. And many of them would stand there and be paranoid. And I would have to remind them that it's okay. Just clean it up. That's the only rule. You gonna make a spill. That's a natural thing in life. You gonna just clean it up. So that winds up being an example of how the anger or the rage is disproportionate to the event, something that naturally happens, and I'm all out of sorts because of it, right? Another example of the extended wounded ego is blaming others, right? So essentially, we all don't always identify when we're blaming others, because blaming others does not always come out like you're the fault, right? You're the fault. But another example, and a main example on how we use blaming others, is always being the victim in our own stories, right? We're not taking accountability for the foundation we may have set, the energy that we brought into the conversations. We're just shocked at how they responded, right? And if they responded. I had a friend reach out to me today, and they just kind of didn't even ask me how I was doing. Hadn't talked to them in a couple of weeks. Didn't even care. They just went into complaining about an issue that they wind up having, right? And of course I asked them, I was like, yo, is that the only thing you reach for, right? And of course it wind up turning into this space where I may be the blame, right? So blaming others winds up showing itself in us being the victim in our stories and not necessarily taking accountability for how we may have set the foundation for it, right? Another way that it shows up is devaluing or attacking the source of the energy of the injury, right? I say this, I remember I talked about specifically in some of the relationships in my family. The only way that some of these people can get over, they can forgive, is by having you there so they can mistreat you. I'm recognizing this dynamic because I've seen it in my family. So of course I'm applying it to my friendships or the people I interact, and I'm very sensitive in the sense that I'm very aware of when these moments show up, where people are devaluing you or attacking you because you've done something that they feel hurts them, right? That is an example of the externalizing ego, right? So you think about that. Are you one of those people who, when your feelings are hurt, you have to let that person know or let someone know? Someone has to understand. I remember we used to always say, if mama ain't happy, you hear this. If mama not happy, nobody in the house happy. That's a perfect example of devaluing or attacking the source of the injury, right? Next is attempts to reassert superiority or control, right? And many people don't really think that they function in the space of superiority. But how that winds up showing up is the need to prove that the other person does not know more, or the need to be in a space where the other person is pursuing you, the need to be in a space where the other person is responding to your needs and emotion even before their own, right? You don't even consider their needs or emotions. You just need them to respond to yours. That is an example of an attempt to reassert authority or superiority or control over the situation, right? The next way that the wounded ego presents itself is through the internalizing wounded ego. What is the internalizing wounded ego? It is what you expect it to be. It is the ego turns the injury inward. We make ourselves the victim. We allow our traumas to define us. We target ourselves through self-hurt, right? Self-pain. I remember earlier in the show, we talked about how getting tattoos is a form of self-hurt, right? And I have tattoos. So it's not me saying that tattoos are good or bad. It's me recognizing that tattooing is definitely or can definitely be an example of an internalizing wound. Because really, you have to ask yourself, what kind of person would sit there and endure all of that pain for hours, right? So for me, I recognize that that's one of those spaces. Would I get another tattoo? Yes, I would. But I also understand why I'm doing it. And now I'm moving from a space of self injury to a space of understanding, right? So you turn that injury inward and you hurt yourself. That's what winds up leading people to drinking. That's what winds up people leading to drugs. That's what winds people leading people to opting out of their own life. I use this example all the time because we hear it all the time. People profess that they haven't dated in 10 years, 5 years, 15 years, right? That is an internalizing wounded ego, right? Common signs of internalizing wounded ego is feelings of shame, but not just feelings of shame, but feelings of shame because you're in a space of self blame. You're blaming yourself, right? Instead of acknowledging that maybe you didn't even have any control over that. It wasn't you that could have did that. And because you're feeling that shame caused by that self-blame, you're in a space where you withdraw. That's what I mean about the people who opt out of their own lives. They felt some shame with their choices of dating. They had some self-blame. And then they felt like the real answer to this is withdrawal, right? Also, depression or loss of confidence. Depression takes on many, many faces, right? So take some time to do some research because knowledge is power on the many faces of depression. Because many times we are functionally depressed, but we have no idea because we don't know what depression looks like. We just have this one very surface idea that depression is just not being able to do anything, but that does not describe functional depression. Many people that we are interacting with every single day, we're being led by, we're trying to lead, we're interacting with them, are functionally depressed. So depressed is a sign of that, and loss of confidence. How do you recognize loss of confidence? That is, confidence winds up shaping your ability to take risk. And if you are in a space where you no longer like to take these risks, you may have internalized your wounded ego. Avoidance of relationships and challenges. Perfect example. As I dig more into this wounded ego, we understand those are the people that have opted out of their lives, right? Those are the people we just described. They are avoidant of relationships. Some people think that avoiding relationships is how they're going to heal or how they're going to be the best version of themselves. They think without that responsibility and that accountability that they can shape themselves. But again, we talked about healing as a communal event. You need a support. And you also need a space to practice this new skill set. You got to take a chance. If I learn to communicate a little bit more or a little bit better, I have to utilize those new skills in relationships. Those are the people you communicate. I talk to myself, but a lot of times the communication is with other people, right? So avoidance of relationships or avoidance of challenges, that fear, avoiding to take the risk, working a little bit hard, doing the sacrifice because it might challenge you is a sign of you internalizing a wounded ego. Feelings of not being enough. One of the things that we really worked on at the beginning of the show was around our sense of worthiness. It literally is still one of the words on our board. Soul, family, worthy, love, safety, right, and free. So worthy was one of the main things that we worked on, because our sense of worthiness shows up in the choices we make. And we might think that we are worthy, but then when we start looking at our relationships, if we wondering, how did I wind up with this person? I remember I had a friend tell me, as a matter of fact, it was someone I was trying to date, and I didn't understand this, but I'm beginning to understand now. Where they said they wouldn't date me. They said I deserve someone better than them, right? And I didn't understand that because I focused on their worthiness. And I'm like, child, you worthy of blah, 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 so forth, so forth. But now I understand them saying that was about my sense of worthiness, right? If I thought that I deserved a little bit better, if I thought I was good enough for a little bit better, I probably wouldn't choose them. And when I think about my past dating experiences, or I think about this, how I've interacted with people, now in this vision or in this space and time, I can recognize how right they were. Not specifically about themselves, because I still disagree with what they said, but it does show in my dating choice, the people I wound up outside of approval seeking behaviors. But it shows up in our choices on who we build relationships with, right? If we build a relationship with emotionally unavailable people, we're probably emotionally unavailable too, and function within our wounded ego. Remember, we talked about how we naturally confuse familiarity with safety. So because we are familiar with the toxicity, we choose that because it winds up being a safe space for us, right? Fear of exposure or failure is another example of internalizing the wounded ego. That is that fear if people find out that you don't have it all together. People might see that you're actually struggling a little bit. Right? Social media is a perfect example of this fear of exposure. Everybody only presents the best things going on because they reside in the space of fear of exposure, that people might find out that they are human, that they struggle, they cry, they feel grief. So we always present this perfect life there. We're only going on trips and buying new houses and new cars. All of that is functioning from this space of internalized wounded ego, where we fearful of being exposed, someone finding out that we are not perfect. I always recognize that people are functioning with this when they always want to tell you how you're not perfect. I remember we talked about this on this show. I had somebody tell me that I wasn't perfect, and I said, I know that. I'm perfectly imperfect. You're the only person that thought I was supposed to be perfect. That's why you're so disappointed to find out that I'm human, right? So those people who always want to humble you in the sense to let you know that they're not perfect, or they're always presenting themselves to always having it together, right? I always have this people. Nothing is always. So when they always presenting always, that is a huge red flag that they're functioning from internalized wounded ego. Because nothing in life is always. That goes against many of the 12 universal laws that we discussed. There's no balance. If you're always happy, something is wrong. Because how do you know you're always happy if you never experience sadness? Right? Perfect example. All right, so next we are going to discuss I'll be dragging my feet through this. We got a little bit of time. The weak ego, which is different than the wounded ego, right? If you would have asked me before we had this discussion on ego, I would have thought 100% that the wounded ego and the weak ego was the same thing, but they aren't. The weak ego is the ego's limited capacity to regulate impulses, tolerate frustration, manage anxiety, and adapt to reality, right? Simply put, it lacks the capacity. A weak ego does not have the capacity. It's not just limited in the capacity. It lacks the capacity itself to be able to tolerate frustrations, right? Road rage is a perfect example of a weak ego because you can't tolerate frustration. And I used to be the king of road rage. You hear me? I used to get out the car, right? To knock on people's windows because of road rage. King of road rage. Road rage is a perfect example of a weak ego because you do not have the capacity to tolerate frustration, manage anxiety, or adapt to reality. It lack the capacity, not just limited. So how do we develop a weak ego? How do we get to a space of a weak ego? One that many of us are familiar with is chronic childhood stress or trauma, right? Many times we talk about trauma, but we also have to recognize that everything is not trauma. Some of it is something else, like stress, right? One of the examples I wind up liking about this idea is latchkey kids. Those kids that wind up having to be home with the key by themselves for hours. That gives a child an enormous amount of stress because now, instead of being a child, they have to function like an adult with responsibilities. And as parents, we put these boundaries on there to hopefully that these boundaries will make that stress a little bit easier for them to endure, but it is not. Chronic childhood stress or trauma, whether that's environment, whether that's family, whether that's opportunities, all those things can help create a space that has chronic stress or trauma. Inconsistent, intrusive, neglectful, or abusive caregiving can wind up creating a weak ego, right? So abusive caregiving, an abusive caregiver is probably the most commonsensical one of that, right? But neglectful is also a little bit commonsensical when we think about it. The one that we really don't think is intrusive parenting. Many parents or many of us think that being engrossed in our child's life, making sure we know what we're doing, not respecting their privacy or boundaries is a good parenting technique to be able to make sure we're aware of what's going in our child's life. Not creating a foundation or a space where your child feels safe enough to be able to communicate anything with you. We're investigating because we do not have the tools to create that space for open communication and vulnerability for our own children. So we become intrusive, thinking that we're being the best thing. And all that we're doing as being intrusive parents is creating a weak ego in our child, right? Limiting the capacity for our children to adapt to reality, deal with anxiety, tolerate frustration. Intrusive parenting is a dangerous one, right? Also, a major way that weak ego is shaped is through lack of emotional containment. I'm not even going to lie to you. When I saw emotional containment, I didn't know what that meant. So I had to do a little more studying to dig into what emotional containment is, right? Emotional containment is the space that recognizes and validates you. Emotional containment is the space of providing a safe place for feelings to be able to feel, right? To be able to communicate these feelings. If your child is feeling frustration, you allow them to communicate that, right? If you're feeling frustrated or someone is feeling frustrated with you, you create a space for them to be able to communicate that. That's emotional containment, right? And in a space that lacks emotional containment, reactions are punitive, right? Think about all the times that we got threatened to give whoopings. Think about all the times that you threatened to give a whooping, right? Those reactions are punitive. We talked about it when it comes to raising boys. How when we're raising boys and they start to cry, we tell them to toughen up, or we do things to toughen them up. That is a lack of emotional containment, right? The reactions are punitive for something that is very natural in human behavior, such as crying. Another is overwhelming demands without adequate support. I specifically wrote latchkey down because it ties in, and this is a perfect example. It's overwhelming demands to expect your child to function in their home as an adult without an actual adult there, right? There's overwhelming demands without the adequate support. Perfect time. We send our kids home with a key. We tell them don't open the door for strangers, but we're not there to be able to support these decision-making process. That's overwhelming demands without adequate support, right? Those are what causes a weak ego, but what does a weak ego look like in action? First, a weak ego is poor impulse control. What does that mean? It means we have difficulty in resisting the urges, right? And I think about this because generally when we think about impulse control, we think about that in the negative aspect, where if something negative happens to us, we don't impulsively just respond to that. But it winds up being the good thing. As a matter of fact, I had a situation happen over the weekend where I recognized that I was functioning in a weak ego, right? Because I was out with a friend and then ran into a friend that I hadn't seen in years. And when I seen my friend that I hadn't seen in years, I immediately started trying to think about, now, how am I going to be able to kick it with my friend? That lack of impulse control, it was an impulsive thought, even though I was so excited to be able to talk with my friend. Impulsively, I started thinking about, how do I spend time with my friend? How do I kick it with my friend that I hadn't seen in years, right? So that impulse control comes from negative experiences and positive ones. It's just the need to impulsively respond, whether it makes sense or not, or even the pressure of feeling like you have to respond to what is going on right now. It's specifically acting impulsively under stress when you are stressed, especially when we talk about survival, living in that space of survival. A lot of times when we wind up having challenges or difficulties, we wind up responding in that impulsively. I remember when we was kids growing up, I respect my homeboy for this because he understood it when we were children. He understood that. We started working young, right? So we get a job. Most of our parents felt as though, as a man, you don't work, you don't eat. So you start working, right? So we get a job. You wind up losing a job for various reasons. You a kid, right? And everybody wants you to respond impulsively. The advice will be like, you lost your job, you got to take anything. Whatever's available now, so forth, so forth, so forth. That impulse reaction. My homeboy would always say, I'm not just taking something because it's available. I'm going to take my time and find something that is aligned with me, right? So that acting impulsively under stress is how it winds up showed that as a poor impulse control, right? Seeking immediate relief from the discomfort is poor impulse control, right? Escapism is a perfect example of that. The way I would deny my lack of impulse control was I consider myself opportunistic, in the sense that when the opportunity shows up, I needed to be ready to respond to the opportunities that showed up right then. Impulse control, right? And I couldn't give myself the right medicine to help me balance my impulse control because I labeled it the wrong thing. I diagnosed it as being opportunistic in a good way, that I see these opportunities, I jump on it instead of recognizing that it also, and in my case, more than likely, symbolizes my lack of impulse control. So seeking immediate relief from discomfort, escapism, is a perfect example of poor impulse control. Next, a weak ego has a low frustration tolerance, overwhelmed by ordinary setbacks, difficulty in tolerating criticism, stress experienced as unbearable rather than manageable. Many of us have a low frustration tolerance, and we talk about this in a very joking manner. Like, I don't have time for the BS. All you are doing is announcing that you have a low frustration tolerance and you're more than likely functioning from a weakened ego. Because one thing that is true about life is BS. It is a natural form of our reality, right? And having a low tolerance from it does not make us better off. It doesn't allow us to learn the tools, practice the tools of tolerance, period. Low frustration tolerance. Next is reliance on immature defenses. The next conversation that will wind up happening is about the way the ego defends itself, all the many faces of ego defenses, which is important because we have to understand how the ego defends itself to be able to understand what is a mature defense or immature defense. So relying on immature defenses, things like denial, that didn't happen. That's not what I meant. That's not what I said. Even though it is exactly what you said, right? Distortion of the reality, right? As a matter of fact, I wrote something down, and it's so funny. I think I talked about it. My ex from many moons ago, her current boyfriend reached out to me trying to be my friend. I just blocked him, right? But the funny thing about that is, in that relationship when I was with my ex, we wound up having to deal with infidelity, where she was being unfaithful at that point in time, which was interesting because even after I found that out, which was reflective of my sense of worthiness, I still tried to marry that girl. I felt like it was one of those movies like Love Jones or something, like you just go through some tragedy and now you all know this together. All that was me functioning from a weak ego and reliance on immature defenses, right? Distortion of reality. Instead of accepting what was happening to me, I distorted it into movie form so that I could feel better about it. And I still did things that were counter to a healthy version of me in an effort to distort this reality, right? Reliance on immature defenses is projection. I talked about this the other week, right? I had a disagreement with a friend, and I was upset for one thing. I sent them a copy of my book, an advanced reader's copy, and they never read it. And when I brought it up to them, they apologized by saying, "I'm sorry for always letting you down." And I told them, that's not what I think. I've never said you always let me down. That's not my thing. So I knew in that moment that they were apologizing for how they think about themselves. They projected their feelings of themselves onto me, and that made it seem as though that's how I felt. So projection is an immature defense that a weak ego will use. A weak ego has an unstable sense of self. That means identity shifts depending on the context or the relationship. Reading that, understanding that, learning that, it made me pose a question, because it made me not pose a question, but pose a question to myself. So in our conversations in the brotherhood, the men's meeting on Monday, when we asked that question that was asked at the beginning, how you tell the difference, one of the things that came up is how contextual it is. Depending on the situation, it depends on how we respond. How I am at work versus how I am with my family versus how I am with my friend. They're not all just different personalities, but they also could be a major sign that we are functioning under a weak ego, because our identity shifts depending on context. And regardless on if we're with our family, regardless on if we're at work, or regardless on if are with our friends, a healthy ego is the same person in all of those places, right? And as a collective, we have labeled this idea of this unstable sense of self as code switching. And it's wild because I used to see people at work that I knew wholeheartedly that that's exactly how they act outside of work, right? And the funny thing about it is we'd always look at that behaviors or look at those behaviors and be like, that's crazy. But it isn't that crazy. As wild as it may have been, they were functioning under a healthier ego than we were, because they're consistent regardless of the context. So an unstable sense of self is the identity shift depending on context, and that's a sign of a weak ego. Another sign of a weak ego. Okay. Forgive me. All right. Another sign of a weak ego is, or an unstable sense of self as it relates to a weak ego, is high dependence on others for direction or validation, right? When I thought about this, the first thing that popped in my mind, we talked about how some social media is a form that we use for validation for others. But think about all the things that we have done just for the approval of our parents, right? That's one validation. We want our parents to look at us and be like, I'm proud of the person you've become. I'm proud of all the things you've done. We seek that validation. And many of us depend on that validation, especially from people like our parents, to feel a whole sense of self, a stable sense of self. So that high dependence on others for direction or validation. If you get you a man and you cut your mind off, that could be you functioning in a weaker self. If you get your woman and you feel like you don't have to think about that anymore because you have a woman, you might be functioning in a weak ego, right? So that high dependence on others for direction or validation. An unstable sense of self is difficulty in maintaining boundaries. And that's one of the ones I'm working on, right? We, as a collective or as a group, we had to reshape our relationship with boundaries. We had to acknowledge that, one, we had our boundaries too close to our limits. So when somebody crossed our boundary, we act like we were at the limit, because we literally were. We did not create any space in between the boundary and the limit where we can have some healing, right? And then one of the things we wind up doing is going all the way into the other end of the spectrum, where we're over regulating our boundaries when that's not necessarily needed. Healthy boundaries don't really have to be stated all the time. Well, scratch. They do have to be stated sometimes. They don't have to be enforced, because people recognize and respect the healthy boundaries, right? So difficulty in maintaining boundaries, but having a realistic view on what boundaries are and how to maintain that. We don't want to just say, because I have difficulties cutting people off, Or I have difficulties in saying no and thinking that means we have a weak ego, right? Or even that space where we said no initially and we changed our mind, right? That's a little bit different. Difficulty in maintaining boundaries is being honest with yourself. Difficulty in keeping your word to yourself, right? So if you said self, I'm gonna start losing weight. I done reached as big as I want to be, so I want to do something different. And then you don't do anything different. That's a perfect example of not being able to maintain healthy boundaries that you created for yourself, right? Difficulty in regulating emotions is a major sign of a weakened ego, right? So difficulty in regulating emotions is emotions feel overwhelming or uncontainable, which we just talked about, emotional containment. So these feelings are so strong that you don't know what you're gonna do, or you just can't deal with it. It allows you to get in a space where you feel the emotions so intensely that you don't have space to feel anything else, even how to move from those emotions that you're feeling so intensely, right? They're stuck in the space where you are overwhelmed by your own emotions, or you have thoughts and feelings that you cannot contain these emotions. Sometimes it can be love emotions. I don't want us to get in this space where we're just thinking about the negative emotions that we feel. The positive emotions feel like this are also included in this, in difficulty in regulating emotions, right? I talked about the impulsivity of seeing someone that you like, or when we like to call it love bombing. That is a general thing that we wind up saying for everyone, but it's not always love bombing. It is impulse control. Somebody found you, somebody is amazed by you, and they cannot control their impulses on telling you how amazing you are, right? I feel that about myself, right? I feel like I'm amazing. So anybody that meets me, they gonna struggle with a little bit of containment, right? So the next one is rapid shifts between anxiety, shame, anger, or withdrawal, right? Just changing. You ever talk to somebody where you're in a conversation and you feel like they've checked out the conversation? You started the conversation, they were invested. And the next thing you know, they checked out the conversation. And then they feel a little bit of anger. Or you wind up seeing shame on them. Those rapid shifts. We're not supposed to be able to get stuck. We're not supposed to get stuck in any emotion. But we also don't want to be shifted between emotions so quickly, because it makes us seem unstable. Because we are functioning unstable. And that instability is a sign of functioning within a weak ego, right? I wrote down, oh no, so scratch. Another sign when it comes to difficulty regulating emotions for a weak ego is difficulty in self-soothing without external support. I literally wrote down emotional support animals. That is a perfect example of difficulty in self-soothing. I do not have the tools to be able to soothe myself. When you was a kid, some people suck their thumb, but now you're grown, you don't suck your thumb, right? You don't pat your back, you don't rub your own head. Those things that you used to do aren't necessarily working. So you have difficulty in self-soothing, and you look for outside resources, whether it be alcohol, whether it be drugs, whether it be food, or your favorite cat or your favorite dog. Those are external supports to help you stabilize your internal world. Emotional support's a fantastic example of someone that might be functioning within a weak ego, right? And I'm really thinking, do I really want to start the ego defense mechanisms? There are a rack of them. I have 10 different ones So I don't think that we're going to get through the 10, and I want to be mindful of the time. So we'll start there. And I don't want to be in that space where next week we start moving into the identity phase of ego and we're splitting conversations, right? I want to make sure that we are finishing one and putting everything in that. So next week, what we'll wind up doing is talking about the ego defenses. And then we will also spend a little time asking some questions that help us be able to assess where we are as it relates to our ego, where we're moving, how we navigate some of these situations. We'll do that like we did with the universal laws. We'll make sure we ask us some prompting questions to help us assess where we are. And then if we have a little bit of time, we'll start into the ego, the identity-based ego. But again, our focus will be able to make sure we understand ego defenses and assessing how we navigate our ego as a functional idea and not an identity idea. So family, with that, I'm going to wrap up tonight's show. I'm excited. I keep pulling my tie up because I got a new shirt. And yeah, these designs feel a little furry. Well, my tie don't sit right the way I like to, right? So, Ty, do you swear you be here to the end? Type something, because this is my new shirt. Boo! I feel like, listen, I feel like you did that just to prove me wrong. I'm going to prove you wrong. See? There I go. Functioning in a weak ego. I'm overwhelmed by my wrongness that I'm still trying to reshape reality so I can be right. But thanks. You beat me. Take your dub and go on about your business. But again, family, it's my new shirt, so I like it. But, Anyway, so hopefully, if you got a little time, you can come out Thursday night at 7 p.m. and watch book club. Watch book club as we continue reading Changeling by Victor LaValle. If you can't make it out here Thursday for book club, I hope to have you back here next Tuesday as we continue our discussion around beyond the ego. We're making sure that we understand that we don't destroy, but we integrate our ego, our feelings of ego. If you're just now joining, I appreciate you. You can watch the recap of the show on Twitch or YouTube. They both have every video we've ever done, so you can catch in on that. Or come back next week, 7 p.m. Eastern, and join the discussion, right, with us around ego. I thank you all for your time, your support, your energy. Without you, none of this could really be possible. This collective energy that we have as it relates to healing and being around individuals that are also trying to be the best version of themselves. Forgive my laugh, man. I'll let you have your little celebration. Somebody is excited because if you're not on Twitch, you don't know what I'm talking about. But on Twitch, somebody's excited and they won. They finally beat me at something, and I got to let them do their little dance. So this is your reminder that you can trust your intuition, that your imagination is powerful and can create solutions you never, ever, ever dreamed of, that you think clearly because you have taken the time to rid your mind of the things that stood in the way of your clear thinking, and your third eye or intuition sees all, right? Again, family, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your effort. I appreciate you as always. And I look forward to seeing you either back with us Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, or, Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern, or back here Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. Thanks. And hello. With that, family, I say peace.